Welcome to the INTJ Equation, a channel on typology and psychology from the lens of an unhealthy INTJ. I am your host, Jeff, and today I am joined by Chris from Asurapsych. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself? You probably don't need much of an introduction in this community.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Chris. I run the YouTube channel Asurapsych. I am a certified MBTI practitioner. I work with clients in assessment and coaching. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I volunteer in psychology research. That's pretty much it.
Very cool. All right, but before we get into it, I'd like to remind you to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. I am slowly getting my podcast on audio format, Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify, and all that good stuff. So make sure to find it on there, follow it, and also leave a comment below if you have anything to say. All right, so what's your experience as an INTJ been like overall?
Overall, you mean just like throughout the lifespan?
Yeah.
It's one of those things where, as a kid, I would say I probably felt different than a lot of the other kids growing up. I always felt like it's not like a feeling of like specialness, but it's almost like you're one step removed from the average person you meet. And it's like there's this weird disconnect when you try to interact with others and you're like, why don't they see the things, why don't they see things the way that I see them? And it's not necessarily like you see them better or you see them worse. It's just you see them differently. And that was a constant feeling for me growing up. And especially all the way through my teenage years, I think that caused a lot of, it starts as like feelings of rejection or even maybe anger towards other people where you're like, why can't they understand me or why am I not understood? But I think as I got older, I started to realize that, part of that's on me. It's on me to kind of, learn how to make myself understood to most people. And once I developed that mindset and started interacting with more people, I think it became a lot easier being an INTJ,
Mm-hmm. Did you feel that you didn't understand yourself at any point, or were you always pretty self-aware?
That's a weird one because I've always felt like in terms of like FI, I know the kind of person that I am. I've never like questioned who I am in terms of like what are my values or morals. And if I ever do something that I think goes against that, I usually kind of beat myself up really hard over that for a while. But I did have doubts at times of like, where do I fit into the world? Like what should I be doing, or what should my goal and place be amongst the world?
How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 26.
26. Okay. And when did you discover typology and MBTI?
So I first came across it in high school. It was either 16 or 17. I can't remember if I was a sophomore or junior. It was in a health class. They brought it in and they brought a practitioner in and we all took the written test. And I got INTJ then. And it was one of those things where at the end, we all went up to the board and we tallied what type we were. And I was the only INTJ in the class. And I remember at the time thinking like, what does that mean? Like out of the 26 or so people here, why am I the one who's this type? And what does that mean? But I kind of dropped it for a few years. And then a few years later, I picked it back up after I heard someone talking about it again. And I was like, oh yeah, I remember what type I got. And just kind of studied it, started participating in online communities. For a while, I was like a senior moderator on personalitycafe.com. If anyone uses that site still, I don't know. And then from there, I went and got my certification and was all leading to where I am now.
Okay, very cool. You said that have you got into grad school yet, or are you still looking for
I'm applying. So unfortunately, I'm applying for clinical psychology PhD programs, and they're some of the most competitive programs in the country. I'm on year 3. My applications are in right now. And despite publications and a straight A GPA, I haven't even gotten a single interview. So that's how competitive they tend to be.
Really? Okay, that's something that I was consider doing myself. Did you like propose? Are you doing something that's typology related that you propose, or how does that look?
Not currently. I'm interested in maybe working with typology as a side thing, but I like to treat typology more as like a philosophy of understanding and helping people as opposed to a clinical science. And I'm interested in working with severe psychopathology. So I want to work with like schizophrenic patients, for example. And I think that that is going to be maybe compartmentalized away from typology in my mind, because I see them as very similar but different. You know, I wouldn't want to treat a schizophrenic patient with typology advice, for example. I'd want to treat them with very specified, you know, clinically focused training.
I just recently got started at a mental health hospital, and I definitely see my fair share of schizophrenics. Do you think that typology manifests in psychosis at all?
That's a difficult question, because it's one of those things, it's like a chicken and egg type of question, right? Where it's like, does being a certain type lead you to have certain disorders? Does certain orders lead you to have, a certain type? For example, if you find someone with schizoid personality disorder, there's no way they're going to test as an extrovert, because the primary characteristics of being schizoid is introversion.
Mm-hmm.
So are they naturally cognitively introverted, or do they have something that's preventing them from going into the outer world and interacting that could be treated? I mean, so I do think that there's mixing, but I think it's more like when Jung wrote about the psychological types, he was writing about the standard average relatively healthy people. Like, this is a model of, conceptual understanding for most people.
Okay, so you think it'd be pretty much impossible for like someone with schizoid personality disorder to test as like an ESTJ or ESFP or something like that?
I don't think I could ever see that happen specifically with that, that disorder, because it's
Yeah.
characterized by such extreme introversion. But we do see clusterings. It's interesting because if you look at who's got bipolar or borderline personality disorder, it's almost always like NPs, specifically like NFPs. Or if you look at the schizoids, it's almost IN types specifically. Like, you don't often see IS types with schizoid personality disorder. And so there are clusterings, and it's hard to say, did the type lead to them testing or getting clinically assessed in that way, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, I definitely seen my fair share of ESFPs and ESTPs with borderline for sure too. I think that's pretty common. And I myself, I developed avoidant personality disorder growing up with my
Really?
own past experiences and stuff. So I think that's something that INTJs could be pretty prone to getting.
Yeah, especially with like avoidant dismissive attachment styles. I've seen a lot of INTJs have struggles, and myself included, sometimes when it comes to relationships. There's this kind of like detachment from your emotional experience to other people's emotional experience, and you want to kind of build a wall there. And if you're not careful, that wall can become too big to the point where you can no longer communicate with other people.
Yeah, for sure. And you're married to an ENFJ, right?
Yeah, I think she's an INFJ. It's always hard. I say it's really hard to type people you've known since before you started like typing people, because it's like you have all these biases about what you think about them and what they, how they act, those sorts of things. But I'm pretty sure she's an ENFJ. She might be an ESFJ though.
And how does that for you? I know like with like FE heroes, FE DOMs, it's a little overwhelming for me at times. You never get overwhelmed by her gregariousness?
No, not for the most part, because she takes on more of the caregiving role than the authoritative role. Because in my opinion, there's almost like different versions of FE, where you have like the FE, like almost like pseudo ENTJ, where they like take up a leadership role through extroverted feeling, and then you have more like caregiving, receiving type of extroverted feeling, where they're adaptive to their environment. Those are the ones who typically struggle with like setting self boundaries, for example.
Yeah.
And my wife's a good example of that, where she's very people pleasing. So it's never really been an issue. It can be sometimes a struggle if she's got a lot of emotions going on, because she doesn't, unlike me, who I have an emotion and I just kind of sit on it and process it for a day or two. For her, it's got to be released. It's got to come out somehow.
Yeah, just kind of like high SE, just got to get that out of the moment, their frustrations or their whatever they want to get out. I see that. You ever look at like the Linda Barron's interaction styles, kind of distinguish who's a ESFJ or ENFJ?
No, not particularly. So the main model of interaction styles I use is first last letter, like IJ, EJ, IP, EP. I'm vaguely familiar with the Linda Barron's interaction styles, but not a whole ton.
Okay. All right. I'd like to get into the functions a little bit. I kind of like to go down in a row and talk about the shadow functions, which are usually less known. I know you don't subscribe to the 8-function model you before.
I can humor the conversation though.
What's that?
I said I can humor the conversation though, so I can.
Okay, no problem. I know it's not for everybody. So what's your introverted intuition? How have you used that throughout your life?
So the analogy that I like to use, and some of you who've like watched me on Joyce's channel as well might recognize, I've said this a few times. For me, I just like to describe introverted intuition for me as kind of like a still body of water. It's unmoving, but when a rock is thrown into this still body of water, in this case, a rock could represent an idea, an event, anything. The water shapes and forms around this rock to understand it, to find its qualities, to adapt to it. The issue with that is that introverted intuition for me struggles to move on its own, and that it's receptive in nature. Unlike extroverted intuition, which I would compare more like a moving river, where the water is moving and can shape and form around the things that it is moving towards. Introverted intuition instead attempts for me to completely understand something that is of interest, that is received to it. That's why we get those kind of aha moments, I think. Now, one thing that I like to differentiate in the community with MBTI is if you're someone who gets the aha moments and they're like extremely profound and you're like, whoa, like I had an aha moment, there's a good chance you might not be an introverted intuition dominant type, because I think that style of living is so common for the NI dominant types that it's no longer a surprise. Like that's literally just their way of handling information. So an aha is less of a exciting moment and more of like, oh, I see. Like, okay, I see what this is. Like, I understand. And like when you're having just that type of style of thinking over and over again, that's just how you come to understand things. I think for me, the weakness of introverted intuition is that I struggle to actively think of solutions for things, especially if they're in the realm of kind of like TI. So it's like, I don't like solving like logic puzzles and stuff because it's like, I feel like I have to hold the things in my head. Like I have to hold the knowledge and work through it piece by piece. And for me, NI, most of the time, it's like looking at something and my brain goes, I see, I found the pattern, I got it, here's the answer. And when I feel like I have to work for the answer, NI is not the best function in my opinion. But unless TE can also be involved, which is kind of like brute forcing it with, things that you've learned or done.
Yeah, like trying to get just through it as quick as you can, not really gather all the knowledge, just kind of find a solution and move on.
Right.
So you said like comparing an NI Dom with somebody who's not an NI Dom, like your wife would come to a different conclusion with using her NI, you'd think?
Yeah, and what's interesting is like the great thing about NI is, as Young described, is it's subjective. So like your NI is going to look way different than another person's NI. And what's really interesting is if you talk to like an NE person, if you ask them how they came to a conclusion, they're far more likely to be able to tell you, because they're like, oh, I can point to the thing in the external or objective world as a reference point of data for the reason that these two things are connected or how I came to this conclusion. Or the NI type is usually just like, it made sense to me, or like it seems like it's going to happen that way. I know an example I like to use is when I'm watching movies. I'm always like, my wife gets mad at me because I'm like constantly throwing out like what I think the ending's going to be or what's going to happen right next to the movie. We were watching one of it's either Disney or Pixar movies called Coco, and they get trapped in a well. And I said, look, the person's going to fly in on a dragon in like 5 seconds. And 5 seconds later, the person flew in on like this dragon. She goes, how did you know that? And I was like, it's just like storytelling calls for it. Like I've seen enough stories to guess what is likely to happen based on the patterns that I've recognized. And that is something that I frequently find myself doing. And that can differ from like her. And sometimes she'll say something or predict something that even I didn't catch because her NI has experienced different things than I have, or her FE maybe has more patterns that are associated with social spheres.
Yeah, I see your polyhedral die in the background with the 20-sider. So
oh yeah, I play D&D every week.
Yeah, are you a DM or do you play as a character?
I used to DM a lot, but when I started doing more YouTube work and stuff, I let someone else DM so I could have more time to kind of focus on my channel and my coaching and stuff. So that way I don't have to, it's a lot of writing to be a DM. Like you have to actually plan and prep, and I'm lazy sometimes.
Yeah.
I love DMing though. It's just maybe later in life I'll get back to it.
Was never my cup of tea. I prefer to play. I love having INTP dungeon masters. I think they're the best at the creating the worlds, and
My dungeon master's an INTP right now.
uh,
She's great.
and it's just great to use. I think they really like the NI, like figuring out like their campaign and kind of poking holes in it basically, and figuring how to get past their obstacles and stuff. I think it's a lot of fun.
Oh, I love D&D.
I saw your video on that too, like the cognitive functions and the stats basically, right? And
Yeah.
yeah,
I started a blog on it. I just haven't finished it yet.
Yeah.
Never got around to it.
That's cool. And how about your extroverted thinking? How does that work?
Yeah. So for me, I kind of like to describe extroverted thinking as the sword at my side. And what I mean by that is a lot of the time it stays in its sheath, but if there's a problem or, an opponent in the way, I am very willing to pull out that tool or weapon as needed to kind of cut through whatever thing is in my path. And I think this can actually be surprising to some people because, especially if you want to like throw Enneagram into the mix, I'm a 5-wing 4 as opposed to a 5-wing 6. So a lot of the INTJs that I work with, coach, or friends with are, I would say, even more intellectually focused than I am. They're very like problem solving, want to understand things. But for me, I'm literally just kind of like always doing my own thing. And then TE comes out when a problem needs to be solved, and it, other than that, it stays relatively quiet and less needed.
Yeah, I did a podcast with Joyce Ming a few months ago, and the way she distinguished like a 5-wing 4 and a 5-wing 6 is a 5-wing 4 prefers to use their FI, where a 5-wing 6 prefers their TE. I kind of resonate with both, so I don't really know how much. I don't know a whole lot about Enneagram either. I don't know how much I subscribe to the wings, but I kind of resonate with both in a lot of ways. So I think in my healthy state, I relied more on FI, but I think you got to kind of balance it more.
I think there's going to be that balance. And it's weird because like as an INTJ, as from a persona standpoint, most INTJs relate with extroverted thinking more. Like you want the world to see you as a thinker as opposed to a feeler. But then you talk to them in person, and a lot of the times, a lot of their decisions are based on their feelings, their purpose, their goals, and that's not always going to be inherently linked to a logical reasoning as much as it is something like just a feeling that they have.
Yeah, I just watched your videos last night of how like the tertiary and the auxiliary function are not necessarily stronger or weaker, or there might even be two auxiliary functions, or so to speak.
Yeah,
I kind of agree with that in a way. That's why I like John Beebe's model. It kind of uses like the archetypes to kind of manifest how it comes out in somebody.
Right.
In a lot of ways.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead and finish your thought.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I discovered the image of Jung's illustration of the psyche like a year or two ago, it forever changed how I viewed the functions, because it was like Jung was literally saying that like, oh, these center two functions aren't rank ordered. They're literally like both auxiliary. And I think that was something that really helped me to understand other people, when I'm typing and working with them, because there's going to be different developmental paths in their life depending on which one of those they picked up first. And that's one of the arguments I have with systems like objective personality, where they type people as jumpers. And it's like, I don't think that that's inherently like wrong and that someone could have a preference for their first and their third function, but I would describe it as part of their developmental journey as opposed to the destination or like the stopping points that defines what they are entirely.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about looping. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it can be a bad thing if you do it too much. I think it could be just as bad using your TE to make decisions and not really considering people. I think you got to put yourself in other people's shoes, and you could just kind of steamroll them, and that could be just as unhealthy or just as unproductive.
Right, exactly. I think like one thing I think people don't recognize is that like NI and FI as a combination can allow for very deep one-to-one empathy with another person.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can really connect with one person and understand their feelings, their position, and all of that. That's not the thing that's exclusive to FE. It's just for FI, it has to be authentic. It has to be what you feel about the situation. Just because, someone's struggling because they're struggling and they're a person doesn't mean that FI is going to feel for them. But if you have that connection with someone, FI can run very deep with that. And I think that's something that is undervalued in a lot of INTJs.
Yeah, especially since INTJs are predominantly male in Western culture, kind of encourages men to suppress their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's just an integral part of our development. And
right.
a lot of ways, like female INTJs have it harder, but I think in that sense for development, they have it easier because they're encouraged to be more emotional.
Right, exactly. They get punished for the opposite, where it's like they get struggles for doing their TE instead.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's why when you work with female NTJs, they're like, oh, like everyone's, you know, no one wants a TE girl, or that, you know, that's what they say at least. But it's
Yeah, can definitely, they could feel like it's males, I guess, being emasculated by them and stuff if they're not careful with their tact. I think FI and FE are kind of like more tactful.
right.
Yeah, and I also resonated too, like I'll build like a D&D character. I don't like power game or anything like that. I kind of make it like how I want them to be and what I like, the characteristics I want and stuff like that. Kind of like going to FI. Is that kind of something you talked about in your videos? Like you don't necessarily make the most powerful character is going to win. You'll kind of give you the best experience basically and going to enjoy the most, right?
Right. Any game I play, I almost always, I'll pick like 5 or 6 characters that I think are like cool, aesthetic pleasing, whatever, and then I'll usually kind of TE pick the best of the ones that I like. You know, it's not like I'm just completely throwing the TE out the window, but it's like, you know, I recognize that these are the ones that I like, and even though this character who's outside of those ones that I like might be the best, I'm not going to use him because I don't like him. You know, I don't relate to his personality, this, that, whatever.
Yeah, like a long time ago, of all the types, I had an ESTJ dungeon master, and
Oh,
it's odd, right? He was actually like a cop and stuff too. It's kind of funny. He would get like frustrated with me, like, why don't you do this and make your character stronger? Like, I just want the flavor, I want the context. I just, you know,
right.
and I'll make him come to life and, you know, in extraordinary ways, I think.
Because it's easy to just power game D&D, but it's more fun. Yeah, there's like a billion different classes. Try something new. And I like to play D&D with characters who are not like me. Like I like to make like ESFPs. Like I'll make my character someone who's outgoing, social, and I'll purposefully say this character doesn't think about what he's doing in the long term, so he acts. And my dungeon master's like, great, you know, if that's how you want to play your character, do that. And it's like, yes, this character doesn't think through his actions; he just does what's on his mind. And it's fun to kind of get out of your own headspace and try those things.
Yeah, my favorite class is the bard, hands down.
Yeah, bards are fun.
Yeah, I think that I really subscribe to, like, you kind of flip to your dual side, like in socionics. I think INTJs really kind of want to be ESFPs in like an intrinsic way and vice versa. So I think that's kind of a way that comes out into us. We can kind of express ourselves in that way.
Right.
Even getting in front of a camera and microphone, which is pretty nerve-wracking for most INTJs, a kind of something
especially at start. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the first like 2 years of my channel was just me with Photoshop images on the screen, just because it was like I didn't want to be on camera.
Yeah, I started blogging and I eventually started this, and
But you get over it pretty quick, I think. Like it takes time and it gets easier.
yeah, it's just starting things. That's a big thing about Linda Barron's interaction styles, where chart the course and we can finish things, but we have trouble starting it.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's kind of like the NI and NE. Like you see all the possibilities with NE, but you want the best one with NI.
Yeah. So why start if it's not going to be the perfect thing right off the bat? Like,
Yeah. How else does FI manifest in you?
I would say I actually tend to feel things relatively strongly, but I don't think I ever share like a feeling that I have with other people. Like I cannot think of a time where I was like, had a strong feeling and was like, you know what, I want to talk to somebody about this. It was like, no, I've felt this and it's mine and I have it in this little bottle, and that it's a nice experience to have that emotion, and what can I learn from it? You know, that sort of thing. That's a lot of the times how I see my own emotions, as like experiences that are to be learned from. Why did I experience this emotion? Why am I feeling this way right now? You kind of go third person a little bit, and start to look at yourself feeling your own emotion. And it's interesting for me to stop and think about that sometimes and just process what led me to feel a feeling in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's well, I've been in therapy off and on for years and years because of my disability, I guess, if you want to call it. I find that sharing your emotions and just opening up to people can kind of open a lot of doors and make you more vulnerable. But I know, especially as INTJs, we don't want to show that vulnerability. We kind of see it as weakness with people.
And I'm not saying that INTJs overall don't. So if you're an INTJ out there who likes to, talk about, share your feelings, that's fine. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm just, for me, from a personal experience, I often see my emotions as like a part of me. And if I share that, it's like I'm giving away something that's me, that's part of me. It's like, taking away from my experience.
Yeah. All right. And how about your SE inferior?
SE inferior is an interesting one. So like many of the other, SE lower types, I tend to struggle a little bit with like the binging thing. I talk about a lot on the channel how I used to weigh 300 pounds. I was a big guy. I ate a lot, didn't really think about my own body, my health, my weight, and I lost a bunch of weight. I would say in my daily life, though, it shows up in a complete like frustration and disregard for the daily things that I should do to take care of myself. Like it's a chore to shower, it's a chore to brush my teeth, and sometimes, like I'll admit, I'll go sometimes days without doing these things. Usually not showering. I'm pretty good about that. I'm not that gross. But like sometimes the basic hygiene things can fall to the side, just because like I don't have the energy or patience to want to deal with those things. They don't come to me very natural. I don't think I've ever like combed my hair, for example. It's just, like I struggle to take care of the basic necessities.
Yeah, I think the going to the shadow functions, I think that this describes it in a different way. Like the last function, the demon function, is SI. It's kind of about self-care and disciplining yourself. Like, like overeating is bad for you, but you kind of indulge in it anyways. It's kind of like it can be like a coping skill, or just kind of like the sensory overload, and you kind of cope with it in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever like do any sports or any activities like that to kind of exercise your SE?
Well, I had a very active job for like 6 years. So for a while, that was kind of like my SE, 8 hours of walking 25,000 steps a day will get you some SE. But after I stopped that, I just started going on like daily walks. To me, that helps me think a lot too. And if I'm like brainstorming for a video, I pace around my house. Like for me, my best thinking comes when I'm doing some sort of light activity.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been a huge fan of martial arts. Specifically, I like fencing and swordplay. Unfortunately, there's no studios around me anymore. So, I mean, I go outside and practice forms every now and then, but for the most part, that's the extent of my SE at the moment.
Yeah, one way I did it was doing judo. I've been doing judo off and on for 6 or 7 years, and it's been a lot of fun, and I'm actually getting quite good at it.
I had a Taekwondo dojo, whatever you want to call it, but they closed. So that was my only outlet.
Oh yeah, just because of COVID, or
Yeah, they closed right around the beginning of COVID.
you live in a pretty small area, or?
Yeah, I live in a very rural town.
Yeah, that's always a problem. That's why I moved to a bigger town.
Yeah, one day.
Yeah. Then you're not opposed to like moving to other city or something for grad school if you get accepted like across
Oh no, goodness no! I'd love to get out of my town. It's not that I like hate my town. It's just I want, like, to me, I'm ready to be inspired by something new. I've been living in the same town my whole life, and it would be nice to kind of, find something else, grow. I feel like people grow if they leave their familiar zones.
Yeah, for sure. I grew up in I was living in a little community of 600 people, and it just drove me nuts. There wasn't enough stimulation for me, like enough stuff to keep me entertained. Like farming stuff, it doesn't do it for me.
Exactly. I live in a little farming town as well, so I get you.
Yeah. Lost my train of thought. Oh, you said you did you participated in research at a university or something like that. What does that entail?
Yeah, so I started when I was doing my undergrad degree. Right as I graduated, I was in a psychophysiology lab, so I worked with EEG scans.
Mm-hmm.
I mainly did the basic stuff, like applying the equipment, running the participants through trials, cleaning. I coded eye tracking data, stuff like that. Because when it came to actually doing and reading the data, like that sort of thing, the PhD mentor did most of that. It was his lab. But that mentor moved to a different university. But he reached out and was like, "Hey, I know, you're from a little town. You don't have many research opportunities." So he kind of offered to take me under his wing for a year or two. And I've been doing volunteer research with him and his PhD students. And then this previous year, I co-authored my first academic paper, which is going to be published this year, I believe, as long as it passes approval. And then in March, I'm flying out to present my first academic poster that I authored myself. So
Very cool. What's he studying exactly? What's he trying to find in the scans?
So he worked a lot with anxiety, depression, that sort of thing. PTSD was also one of his areas of study. My study was on depression and anhedonia and the relationship between those. It's a complicated study to go into right now, so I'm not going to go in all the boring details, but it's a lot of kind of like depression, anxiety, that sort of thing.
What would you call it? Manadonia? Oh, like a lack of pleasure. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And you think that's something that's prevalent in INTJs, or?
I mean, I could see INTJs struggling with that maybe more than some of the other types. The ITJs, like the tertiary FI, tends to be very flat affect. I find that many of the ITJs are very hard to anger, but also hard to please, if that makes sense. They kind of ride that fine middle line.
Yeah, for sure. Right, we'll jump into the shadow functions a little bit. So the first one is opposing personality or nemesis, whatever you want to call it, for extroverted intuition. Do you know much about that, or do you need me kind of get the guide?
So I can talk about my experiences and understanding with these functions from like how I as an individual view these models and how they exist, I would say, like almost outside of my psyche. So the way that I always interpret it is that your fifth function is that it's a function that very rarely shows itself because you're kind of so deeply rooted in your dominant one. So as an introverted intuitive dominant type, it's very hard for me to go away from singling down an idea into branching it out into many things in the external, objective world of concepts. And that's why I've oftentimes get along extremely well with types who have top 2 extroverted intuition. All the NPs, I find it's really easy to communicate with because they act as kind of like a bouncing board almost times, where they'll start a conversation that I think is interesting, and I can just kind of occasionally give a piece of insight in return to like, okay, here's how I would take these 5 ideas that you just gave me and put them into one, or like, narrow them down to whatever the one's the best one. So I would say I don't have very good extroverted intuition, if that's what you mean. It's hard for me to do that.
Yeah, I think how the opposing personality, where John Beebe wrote it, it's kind of like a villain archetype for Jung. It kind of works against your I. So I know for me, this is coming from me because I'm unhealthy and I'm trying to kind of individuate myself and everything like that. Like I'll lay in bed, like I have a 5-year-old son, and I'll think of like all the horrible things that can possibly go wrong with him and everything like that. But I've worked in prisons, and like I said, I work in a behavioral health hospital, so I've seen a lot of bad people in the world.
Right.
And you can be very paranoid of other people's intentions and stuff like that. Have you ever struggled with like paranoia or anything? Like people are
personally, no, but I like to preface this. I talked about it in Joy's videos too. I'm extremely low in neuroticism. Like I test under like the 5th percentile. So I think that could very well be a reason why maybe I don't have as many of these negative thoughts as a lot of other people. Even things like anxiety are very rare for me, even like basic anxieties. I tend to be one of those people who's like, it's going to work out, even if it's probably not going to work out.
Yeah, I get pretty high on the neuroticism scale, like 60, 70, pretty.
Right.
It might be a little lower now, hopefully. I haven't took it in a while, but do you think the big 5 is important, or do you think it's just kind of like this little SJ paradigm to kind of explain their own little ways?
I think it's great for studying human personality on a metric scale. I don't think it's very useful in helping people nearly as much as MBTI is. I do think neuroticism is important as a trait. Like the one takeaway that I think Big 5 does well, great, is that neuroticism as a negative trait is something that I think should be measured, because there's going to be individual differences in 50 people of one type in terms of their like neuroticism or how emotionally reactive or stressed or anxious they tend to be. And being aware of that or recognizing that is helpful if I'm working with someone in coaching or if I'm typing someone, because I could easily misinterpret, like a very high neurotic INTJ as an ENTJ if they're aggressive for no reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, they misinterpret things that I say or something, and they get into like a TE kind of attack mode.
I'm guessing, yeah, people that go to you for coaching, I'm guessing they're probably pretty neurotic and unhealthy in their own ways. Do you ever have like pretty neurotypical types come to you?
Yeah, I would say it's like almost more people, I would say, are actually pretty close to, healthier on the neuroticism side. And it's more so like they've hit a rut in life and they're not sure how to like get over that hump or, get through the problem. And the greatest thing about coaching as opposed to therapy is because therapy is kind of like the building's ruined and destroyed and you're trying to like rebuild. Like you're trying to build back up from something that had a rough time or is, a problem area for you. Whereas with coaching, it's more like you're trying to help someone get over a roadblock. You're just trying to like give them a new frame, a new frame of perspective to see their own problems. And I think even people who are not neurotic need that sometimes in life. They just need a second opinion, essentially.
Very cool. We'll move on to the cynic's function or the witch function, which is introverted thinking. I know you mentioned something earlier when you're talking about like you're trying to problem solve or like solve a puzzle, and it was kind of frustrating for you if you had to use your TI.
Yeah. So for me, I it's really weird because I find myself getting really frustrated with TI as a function, especially if I feel like people are doing it too much, because it's like I want to apply things or find like an answer, especially if there's going to be like a time investment involved, as quickly as possible. A great example, especially when it comes to like the puzzle thing I was talking about earlier. Let's say I'm playing a video game, right? And I come across a puzzle. I'm likely to give that puzzle about 2 minutes before I look up a guide. And for me, it's because if my NI is not going to get it in 2 minutes, it's not going to get it in 10. It's not going to get it in 20. And then therefore I'm like, all right, I'm bored with this. Like, I'm not going to just get the answer and I don't want to TI my way through this. So TE is like, well, let's go look for the objective posted answer online and we'll just do that. Another way this can present itself is like when I look at systems like sociotics that are just like TI frameworks to the end of the world. Like that's like, I swear those systems are just like super, like, I don't know how to they're conceptual in nature, but for a descriptive reason as opposed to an application reason.
Mm-hmm.
And it's frustrating for me because the journey of self-growth, I think finding your type is like step one, like the first step up a huge flight of stairs. And it's like systems that are too TI heavy for me are like trying to analyze that first step under a microscope to the point where they forget that the rest of the staircase exists. So for me, it's like I want to understand just enough to get to that step and then move on, because I feel like you can have more growth by doing the rest of the things that come alongside, self-growth and finding your type, as opposed to just spending forever on trying to understand the system that describes it. Does that make sense? I know that's kind of...
No, it makes perfect sense. I think that's the biggest differential between INTJs and INTPs. A lot of them get the two confused, but I think we're quite different, really.
Right. And like I can appreciate an INTP, and I oftentimes have a huge amount of respect for TI until it's in the way of something that I want to do. And then it's like, stop slowing me down. Like I don't want to be bogged down by all this TI.
It's like you said, I love bouncing ideas, especially off INTPs, because sometimes TE just kind of rushes through things and it's not always the most correct way of doing things. So they can kind of catch you and say, hey, that's wrong. Or, you need to like check your thinking here. Or, I think that's a good, like a backboard, like you said.
I always joke that if I die, the first thing I do when I get to heaven or hell, Carl Jung's just going to beat me up for misinterpreting his TI system.
Yeah, yeah, that's
going to be like, stop being lazy with my system.
Yeah, that's one thing. Like Jung is very, very hard to read, I think, for me personally.
Right.
It took a long time to dissect and digest what he says, and he was just like super brilliant.
Yeah. I was reading Jung. It's enlightening, but at the same time, it's like you could have said that in 2 sentences. Like, why did you need 3 chapters?
Like John Beebe, he's an ENTP, and I just read his book, and it's just like, this is so unorganized. Yeah, I know, like with like the TI cynics, a lot of times. But do you ever think like other people think like you? I know you said when you were growing up, you're like, why aren't I like other people? Did you kind of ever assume that people came to the same NI conclusions that you do, and get frustrated when they didn't?
Yeah, because I mean, occasionally I would assume that people would think that about me as well. But I would say the reoccurring thing that happened to me was like I would see something and then be like confused that other people didn't also see it. Like, why didn't you come to this conclusion? Isn't it obvious that such and such happened? Isn't it obvious that he was going to do this, or she was going to be mad when you said this? Like, the prediction of events. It's like I had a friend who like got in an argument with this girl one time, and he said a bunch of stuff, and he was like, I don't know why she got mad, and he like honestly was confused. And it's like I could have told you, like, do you not have the basic foresight and pattern recognition to understand that the things that you're going to do will lead to an outcome? And it's weird when like that's a constant reoccurring thing in your life, when you constantly feel that way.
Yeah, I think that's the next one, the FE trickster. You kind of just don't realize that people's emotions. Are you talking about a friend that was an INTJ or another type?
I think he was an INTP. He was a TI dominant, so he didn't exactly have great FE going on.
Yeah. Do you ever like? I know TE is not really like the most original type of thinking. And kind of like you get it from other sources and other people's in this study and that book or whatever. Right. Do you ever get like frustrated, like you can't come up with your own like TI concept at all, and it makes you feel like stupid or inferior in a way?
I wouldn't say it makes me feel stupid or inferior, but I'm very much aware of the fact that my ideas are built on the shoulders of giants. Like even most of the concepts and ideas that I come up with are like an extension of Jung in some sense, I like to say. Like I did a masculinity and femininity theory that I think was pretty original. I posted it as a blog and I did a video on it, but still it was like, I took someone else's concept and then had my own thought about it and was like, this is a proposition for an idea. I think the difference for me when I'm coming up with these ideas, as opposed to like a TI dominant or a high TI type, is I don't necessarily always believe them to be true. It's more like when I propose a theory or an idea, it's like, this is how I think it could be, and it functions as a model of understanding other people. But that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be reflective of the truth. It serves some sort of conceptual or theoretical purpose.
Yeah, I think TI, it's really searching for the truth, but NI, I think my own theory on NI, it's kind of the truth waiting to happen in a lot of ways. I think you can kind of create your own reality as long as it's not like super crazy, like a schizophrenic rambling or something like that. But
I think it's kind of like the relationship between philosophy and science, where philosophy is often the precursor to science, where it's like, well, what is philosophy? It's practical science when we don't fully understand the thing yet. So a lot of the times I see NI as like, this is the working model of, it's like the four temperaments, right, of personality. Those were created thousands of years ago, right? And that's kind of like a philosophy of personality that we kind of understood later in life was leading to the fact that there are differences in human personality that can be categorized and typed into different things. And for me, I see myself coming up with philosophies of psychology or science far more than I do like actual models of, explanation, I think.
I didn't watch the video on your theories on femininity and masculinity. Can you elaborate more on it?
Yeah, so I think the basic concept is that each component of a function necessarily has its own masculine or feminine attribute to it. So for example, I described introversion as inherently a feminine component, whereas extroversion was inherently a masculine component. I described judging or rationality as inherently masculine, whereas perceiving irrationality was inherently feminine. So therefore, I kind of gave a set of masculine and feminine markers for each cognitive function. And then you kind of could see rank ordered in the type, like what functions were likely to be masculine or feminine present in the type. So introverted intuition in my model is the most feminine model, or the most feminine function, because it's introverted, it's intuitive as opposed to sensing, because sensing is concrete and therefore more masculine as a function. And it's a perception function, as opposed to a judging function, and therefore it's a feminine function, as opposed to the most masculine function in my theory is extroverted thinking, because it's extroverted thinking as opposed to feeling, as well as a judging function. So it's masculine. And this creates interesting dynamics when you have types like INTJs, who are kind of weird, where they lead with the most feminine function, and then as their auxiliary, they have the most masculine function. So you can see the dynamics between their first and second function and how they interact.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Like INTJs, even like women are kind of seen as masculine a lot of the time. So you think they kind of depend on their TE to kind of manifest that?
Right. And yeah, it's an interesting theory. I have a video and I have a blog post on it. And again, it's not something that I necessarily believe to be true. It's just a working model of something that I noticed as a pattern when I was working with functions that I thought was interesting, and I wrote about it.
Very cool. I think that does ring a bell. I think I watched it a long time ago, actually.
Yeah, it's been like a year or two at this point since I did that one, but
All right. What about your lack of your FE or lack of thereof?
it's a weird one. FE, I always describe as like nails on a chalkboard to me because it's so painfully obvious when I see other people doing it.
Yeah.
And because some socionics models and stuff describe like your seventh function as like this blind spot, and for me it's kind of the opposite, where it's like I'm like hypersensitive to it, but I don't like it. So when I see like my wife doing FE to the point where it's like she's disregarding her own FI, it's almost like, ugh, like do your own thing, but I'm sure like she feels the same way about my FI, or something, when I'm disregarding other people's. I would say that I'm aware enough of the social sphere not to disturb it, but I will absolutely choose my own emotional interest over the social sphere if pressured. Like you can't pressure me into adapting to a social sphere just because it's the right thing socially to do, for example.
Yeah. John Beebe describes it as the trickster function where it kind of tricks you. So like the one big thing for me, and I think a lot of INTJ, is that a lot of people will come up to you for validation and empathy, but we'll just kind of get to the solution oriented thing.
Yeah, the advice, right?
Your TE, and we'll just kind of steamroll their emotions. So I think that that tricks us, that we don't see that they need that FE. They're looking for that FE.
Right. And that, being married to an ENFJ, that's something that I had to learn in the relationship, where, the first 2 years, anytime she'd come to me with a problem, it was like, well, just do this. Like,
Yeah.
why don't you just do this? And it's good intention, right? You're not like trying to just ignore their feelings. But I learned that, for me, it became more practical to instead go into NI mode and just listen.
Mm-hmm.
And like, you let the wave pass, and then maybe if they're seeking a solution, then when they're done, you offer it to them.
Yeah, like one of my favorite types is INFPs, but I scare them.
Yeah.
But I kind of learned to kind of listen to them. Like I think working in like behavioral health, that really helps me. Like people like look at me, like I had this ENFP, pretty sure she was an ENFP, like look at me like, you look like you want to murder somebody. And like she asked, like, were you in the military? Like, no, I worked in corrections. Explaining the whole typology thing at 3 a.m. is kind of hard. And I think,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
And INTJs, of course, most of the time, especially if they're out in public, they're going to have the resting, the face.
Yeah.
And I'm super guilty of that myself. It's something that, it's kind of weird because my like wife doesn't see me as that, because when she's home alone with me, I'm very interactive with her because I'm close with her. So she'll be like, why do you relate to characters that have faces like that? And it's like, because if I'm not with you, that's what I look like. Like that 90% of the time, like if you're at work or something, I'm sitting here with a stale face,
Yeah. That's a big barrier between us and people. I think that's really what ties in the FE trickster for us. I think it's just we don't emit the emotions like an FE. We're not expressive, so we're just kind of blank. And FE users, we're kind of guessing, like, because they want to feel our emotion, like, like, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, what are you feeling? And they can have a hard time reading us. But most of the time I'm just neutral, and
right. And the worst thing FE types will do is they'll pressure you into like trying to express that emotion. And it's like, I'm literally just like sitting here like that. Like, don't pressure me into feeling something. Especially when I'm not actually feeling or ready to feel something.
Yeah. And it's just like, you have the right to feel what you want to feel. They're your emotions,
Mm-hmm.
Or they assume that you're mad or something, but I'm not mad until you start prodding me for this. Now I'm getting a little irritated,
Exactly, right. They kind of are working against their own situation sometimes.
Yeah, but it's just, I kind of come to terms that's just how they work. But it's just so hard because everybody has those expectations, like the group ethics basically, and we kind of have our own way of doing things.
And it's weird because even if you work in like mental health and stuff, it's a weird thing because they'll always tell you that like people should be open and share their emotions, and that's good for your mental health. And it's like, I don't inherently think that's a necessity for a stable or healthy emotional state, I think that comes from the idea that mental health is an FE oriented field. And like that's the natural solution that FE people who work in therapy come up with. So I think that actually in some cases can be harmful for FI types who don't need to be open and talk about their experiences all the time. Maybe they need time to process it. Maybe they don't need to be pressured into feeling something when they're not ready to feel it.
I think expressing your needs is more important than expressing your emotions, really.
Right. Just communication in general, because I think is so important, being open and honest.
Yeah, because a lot of people, like, you know, in my situation, not to make this a pity party for me, but a lot of people don't get their needs and emotions met when they're a kid. So they kind of bottle that up and they don't seek help, especially like INTJs. Like there's a big misconception that we don't need people. I think we just need people to a less extent of other types. We still need relationships.
Right. Yeah.
Do you ever plan on doing any counseling or therapy when you get your PhD?
Yeah. I would like to be a research practitioner. So like a 50-50 split between practice and research. I just want to do what Jung did pretty much. Like I want to work with people and then write about it maybe when I'm older.
So how do you think he came over his, I know he, even when he came up with psychological types, he was kind of in a psychosis mode. Do you think like he was a big, like firm believer that's what the shadow was, is like you have these neuroticisms or you have like psychosis or delusions or whatever, and you're supposed to learn to understand it, integrate that into your personality? How do you think that manifests for people?
That's difficult. Well, for one, Jung was such a complex man. It's hard to know what was going through his mind, because like when he wrote Red Book, he was obviously in a very different mental state than like when he wrote Psychological Types. So the whole like shadow integration thing is, I like to describe it as this, as like if you're thinking about your shadow, which in my mind is often the repressed function, like that's how I think of like the shadow. Or if you want to think about it as like the functions that are in your bottom stack that like you don't have, that's perfectly fine too. But you want to bring them to awareness. And I'm a large proponent of the idea that you shouldn't like waste time trying to master things that are never going to like be natural to you. And the example I like to give is like, say you've got an ENTJ. How many ENTJs do you know throughout history who are recognized for their extroverted feeling? Like I can't think of one, right? And it's like you don't want to tell an ENTJ to waste all this time trying to work on extroverted feeling, when in reality it's more practical for them to work on introverted feeling to become a more stable, better, morally responsible person, so they can have that marriage between TE and FI and then have a stable identity to interact with the outside world. And through that, instead of needing FE and needing to kind of like people please, they instead are a respectful person with morals that people will flock to because of their potential, because of their ability to be a natural born leader, for example.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't really think the shadow functions are necessarily like they're there to develop. I think they're there to recognize and kind of see like how you're being an ass in the world, basically.
Yeah, exactly. What are you not doing, essentially? Like, what are you?
And the last one we talked a bit about was SI demon. How does like SI work for you, or the lack of it, or however you theorize it?
I think we can go back to what I talked about with the SE a little bit too, where for me it's very hard to do the day-to-day things. Like the over annoyance and overindulgence with like sensory things is very common. Jung talks about that in Psychological Lives with the repressed SE, and I relate a lot to that. But with SI in particular, it's just like I really just hate the maintenance. Like, can I not have a body, please? Can I just be an ethereal being that doesn't need a body to function? And also, I get really frustrated. I also have a complete disrespect, not a disrespect. The better word is ignorance for the typical SI things that you think about. Like, for example, like having a fond memory, for example. I don't feel nostalgia. Like nostalgia is not an emotion that I have. Yet I have an INTP friend who feels a ton of nostalgia, even at our age. You know, we're only 25, 26. And he's got nostalgia for the high school days. He's like, oh, don't you just miss high school and all these things we did? And I'm like, no, like I don't miss anything. Because to me, it's like I don't have this appreciation or respect for the experiences that I've had, because I see them as stepping stools to get to somewhere else.
Yeah, like you, I was 300 plus pounds myself, and I lost weight, but I gained some of it back. So I'm definitely trying to work on that.
Me too, a little bit. Don't worry.
Yeah, like I used to have crazy habits. Like I would drink like several 2 liters of Dr. Pepper a day, and I just quit soda. And I'd probably been diabetic by now if I didn't stop. But it's caused me a lot of health issues. Like for most of my life, till I was about a little older than you. Probably I'm 37 now. I didn't have a sleep pattern, and I think that kind of wrecked my health. Now I work nights again, so I don't have a sleep pattern anymore. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I recently just got this nice little fitness band so I could track my sleep. And every day it tells me that I'm in like the bottom 2% of people with sleeping patterns and habits. It's like you get very little deep sleep. And I'm like, thanks. Thanks for telling me that my sleep is awful.
Yeah, like I developed really bad sleep apnea. I think that was just me not taking care of myself, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Down in caffeine and stuff, most likely, if you're anything like me.
Yeah. I'm just gonna wrap this thing up. These are kind of baseline questions I ask everybody, and a lot of people don't have an answer to these, which is fine. Do you have a favorite type?
Favorite type. I don't think I have a favorite type. I do have a type that I get along the easiest with, and that would probably be ENFPs. But it's a limited exposure thing. As in, I like ENFPs for about an hour, and then it's like I need a break. Maybe some INTJs out there could maintain that a little bit more. I don't think I could. Like, a lot of people talk about the INTJ ENFP relationship. And I'm like, yeah, I think that could work. But for me, I feel like that would just drain me after a while. Because as much as I love the ENFP spontaneity, it's also very, very tiring for me. It's like, no, I just need my time to rest and be me. But yeah, I think the NFPs are very easy for me to get along with.
So how does it like work with your ENFJ wife as she come to understand typology? Like you just need this space. Like I interviewed an ENFJ who believes that she has an INTJ son, and she's like, I don't understand why you need so much alone time, but I respect it.
Exactly. That's I would say exactly how she, she feels about it. But we get enough like together time for the most part. Like we like to hang out in the evening and watch a movie or something sometimes. We try to go on dates once every week or two. I think with higher FE types, it's more about like showing that you care. Like you have to show you care with a higher FE type. And as long as you're taking actions to do that occasionally, then usually they feel, respected or valued.
Yeah. Relationships has been a struggle for me altogether, but I think really high FE types it's just a little overwhelming for me. But a lot, again, they don't understand typology at all.
And my wife doesn't understand typology because like I tried to get her into it and she was like, well, why do I need a theory to describe people when I just talk with people? And I just think that's a funny thing for an FE dom. It's like, I don't need a theory for understanding people. I just talk to people. But it was something that we had the struggle with, especially that first year or two, where it was like getting past the crossed wires of like, she needs to talk about her emotions, but I don't want to talk about mine, but I also need space, but she needs to talk about that. And you just find the healthy balance. And I think I'm a big advocate for that. Most types can work together in a relationship if you're patient and willing.
Mm-hmm. My son's mom is an ESFP, and well, we were both very unhealthy and had very rough upbringings, but I kind of think like people in the same quadras don't really get along long term. I think for like short bursts of time. But I think if you have the same coming functions, just in different order, it could be very nerve wracking for each other after a while. I mean, we get along good now, but we had a very vicious court battle and all this and all that. But yeah, we just drove each other nuts, basically.
Shadow relationships in particular are interesting because I think more so than any other relationship, there's going to be very, very, very high highs and very, very, very low lows in those relationships. Where it's like, because you're essentially in a relationship with the person that you want to be, or like you kind of like wish you were in some case, even though you're not, and it's the same for them with you.
Yeah.
So you have these weird like moments of high amounts of respect, but also frustration for this other person. And I see it work. I think it's actually a common dynamic to see people with their opposite type, but those are also the people who seek counseling the most. I think coaching, group coaching, this sort of thing.
I just interviewed an INTJ ESFP couple, but they're older. But I think they kind of, they're more mature, so they can kind of. And the
age
INTJ
is going to balance it out. It's like typing people after 50 is very hard because your psyche is kind of developed.
Yeah. Do you have a least favorite type?
It's one of those things where I wouldn't say it's like my least favorite type, but the type that I have the most struggle with is typically both of the ESJ types.
Mm-hmm.
I like ESTJs, occasionally, because sometimes I need someone to smack me with reality. Like
Yeah.
I need someone to give me the cold hard truth and be like, suck it up, do it. Like, because occasionally that's actually something you need to hear. ESFJ is often, I just don't feel like it ever has naturally connected with me in an ESFJ. And I can't say I've known too many, unless my wife's the one, which, maybe she is. But there's always this, like, it's the FE, but also they tend to kind of enforce their SI values sometimes, if that makes sense.
No, it makes too much sense.
And I don't feel like I see that as much with ENFJs, where ENFJs are a little bit more willing to be like, let's just do whatever, or like, we can get along because we're our own people, sort of thing. There's more of a cohesion on the conceptual scale as opposed to the traditional scale.
I'm sure it varies person to person, but I think a lot of like relationships, it needs a little bit of compatibility and contrast. So like you have the ENFJ, but you gotta have that FE and that TI dynamic going on, but you have like kind of like the compatibility, but you have the NI and SE as well, and that kind of balances things out. I think a little friction is healthy.
Right. Yeah, I actually agree. Sometimes I think friction can be a little bit healthy. Where was I going to go with that? Oh, yeah. A weird thing is like I struggle with ESFJs, but I don't think I've ever met an ISFJ I couldn't get along with. And that's a weird dynamic because it's just like, oh yeah, they're fine. Like, because I find ISFJs tend to be exceptionally patient for the most part. Most of them that I've met, at least.
My sister was an ISFJ and we didn't get along growing up at all, but most ESFJs I see, I pretty get along with them for the most part, as far as I can. All right. Is there anything you'd like others to know about INTJs? I'm sure you talk about INTJs to your blue in the face on your channel, of course.
Just, INTJs are probably not going to be as cold as most people think they are. A lot of people think of them as these very cold, robotic people. I think INTJs have a very deep internal emotional world. It's just something that they're not usually going to share with everyone else. But if you can recognize that they have this and it's something that's there, you might be able to develop, that kind of relationship with them. But if you want to be friends or you want to be in a relationship with INTJ, don't expect them to share that with you. It's like you have to recognize that that's their prized possession at times. And if you can respect that, I think it's easy to get along with INTJs.
Okay, that's a question I want to start asking people. You said you're 26.
Yep.
What advice would you give to your 16-year-old self?
Don't be so edgy. So teenage INTJs are especially guilty of like, they've just found out that TE is a thing and that they can do it. And now they're going to like critique other people and they're going to tell everyone that they're wrong. And they're not going to want to talk to people because I'm good at whatever it is that I'm doing, or they're going to be competitive. And it's like, try to get past that phase as quickly as possible and recognize that like INTJs have a great capacity for empathy if you can develop into someone who can balance your thinking and feeling functions.
Very cool. I didn't really discover typology until my late 20s. I took like 4 of the crappy online tests and I got INTJ twice, INTP once, and INFJ once. Kind of did a little quick look at it and INTJ fit, and I kind of just forgot about it for several years, and I kind of dug into it more deep, and it's been, very, very helpful for me to develop, I think, as a person.
Yeah. I think it's especially helpful for people in like their teens and 20s. Like that's the perfect time to get into type. Well, it's never too late to get into type, but I think that if you discover it early, you're going to have more of a good time developing if you actually apply what it is that you're learning.
I talk to a lot of like 16, 18, 20-year-olds, and it's just hard to type them. Like you think you'll type them, but they're just not convinced of their type.
Yeah. I typed someone who was 15 once, and I said, if you're 18 and you remember me, email me, I'll give you another typing session, because I'm curious to see like if me typing you at 15 versus 18 would be different, because that's a huge transition period in someone's life from 15 to 18. They're very different than like 18 to 20.
What's the earliest age you think you can type people?
Earliest I've done is 15. I don't think I would do earlier than 15. And that's even pushing it. I much prefer someone to be 18 if they're going to have a session, but
yeah, like I have a 5-year-old son. Like I said, I'm pretty sure he's going to be an SE Dom. I don't know if it's going to change. He's been throwing me some curveballs lately. Like I just want to stay home and play by myself. So it could definitely change. I just kind of been keeping an eye on him.
It's so funny with kids because like it's almost like when they're like 3 to 6 or 7, it's almost like they're one function. Like you just see one big old function doing one thing at times, and maybe you see a little bit of peeking out every now and then of another thing. But at the same time, one thing in their life can happen, and then suddenly they're someone else. Like it's like,
Yeah.
oh, what happened? Like, why are you this now? And my general working theory is that I think kids are kind of born into a quadra and then they play with the tools that they have, the functions, and kind of one just is like becomes preferred and then becomes the dominant function in their first few years, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Because when my son was like 2 or 3, I mean, kids don't really start playing with others till they're about 3, but he was very, very independent and like would like, no, I want to do this. And he would try to do it himself and be super determined, want to be like, and just play by himself. But now he's like, yeah, you can do that for me. It's cool.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Kids are interesting.
Yeah, definitely a struggle for INTJ sometimes. All right. That's all I think I have. Do you have any questions for me? Anything else you'd like to let
Nope.
you know?
This was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. It was a good set of questions.
All right. I appreciate you taking the time with my little humble channel.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to check out more of Chris, I'll put his link to his YouTube channel down in the description. You could also like, share, subscribe to my channel. Like I said, I have a podcast that I'm slowly putting up on a podcasting platform. It's like almost 30 now, so it's taking some time. Go ahead and check that out. Leave a comment. I also have a Discord server if you'd like to join that as well. And I thank you for going to be on a clickbait, and have a great day.